Turning a good performance into an unforgettable one isn't just about playing the right notes. It's about creating a connection that resonates deeply with your audience, making every moment on stage meaningful. Hello, and welcome to all of you who are listening. This is Intentional Musicianship, and this is a show designed to explore performance practice, stage presence, storytelling, and audience engagement. My name's Jeff Price, and after a fulfilling performing career, my passion is found helping you go beyond the music stand and connect with your audience. I know what it's like to wonder if your performance hits the mark with your audience, or maybe it was just a nice moment in time for everybody involved. And one goal most of us have as performers is to try to figure out how to transform audience tolerance into genuine engagement. And together, we can brainstorm and find solutions to help transform your performances into unforgettable experiences. For today's episode, I thought we would look at musical communication. And it's just a foundational topic that I thought, we could address because as I go to master classes and I go to performances, I thought this might be a good help for everybody to maybe take a second look from our side of this musical experience and how it impacts our communication on stage. So let me explain. Sometimes we focus a little bit too much on that musical execution of our craft, and we miss the overall picture or communication of what we're trying to do, how we're trying to engage that audience. So today, I thought, we could just look at the book definition of communication and try to overlay that, so to speak, onto what we do as performers on the stage. And then we can close out with just a few tips that could help us illuminate, make those concepts of that performance practice in that room on that stage more effective. So the first thing I want to bring up is a 3-part definition of the term communication. Now, I was breaking this down a couple months ago, getting ready for a talk, and I was struck how involved this particular definition was. So I thought it'd be fun to break it down. So let's give you part 1. Part 1 of the definition says, effectively expresses information to multiple audiences through clear, convincing oral and written communications. So now when I read this and overlay this with our performer mindset and our musician mindset, I think that I have to, as a musician, have fundamental accuracy and mastery of my instrument. And that's why, we're taking these lessons and we spend all those hours in the practice room. We're trying to make sure that from talking performance basics, we're going to musicians. So we're going to be making sure our louds and softs and shorts and longs and all those expressive items on the page, whatever's in your head comes out in the same way when we communicate verbally to someone. So we want to make sure that oral communication from our instrument to the audience is very expressive and comes out in a clear way. So in the second part of our definition, it says, demonstrates logical thinking when describing facts and concepts and shapes communications to meet the needs of a specific audience. Now, I like this, and it struck me because it reminded me that this is a two-way street. Even when we're on stage performing, we react to other stimulus. Sometimes it's just the other musicians that we're working with and we're reacting to. Sometimes it's the hall. And one key is it's also about how that audience reacts to us. And sometimes when we're asked to communicate in one environment, versus another, we have to figure out how to adapt to that particular environment so that, back to the first part of the definition, we expressively, effectively communicate that information. I think that's why we practice all those fundamentals about how crisp and clear we can get an articulation and expand our dynamic range, so we can adapt to what we hear. So for example, my old sections that I was in, we'd adapt our articulation based on what we were hearing on the stage to make sure it got to the audience in the way that we wanted, so that we would hope that that musical part would be very clear to them. So we tie it all together when we get to the third part of this definition, and it says, actively listens to others and demonstrates understanding of their comments or questions. Now, you're trying to figure out how you can get this verbal communication that we do and link it into the musical. So as I was trying to figure this out as a book part of the definition to our role as the performer, I want to fill in that blank for that second part and expand on that reaction and how you adapt on stage, doing that stuff in live, real physical time, adapting to what we're doing, what's happening in the moment. So one of the reasons that I liked this third part of the definition is because when we communicate and we speak language to our intended audience, our participants, when they come to the show, it's just not black and white, because we've been doing it our whole lives. We have subtle shadings and gradations of how we communicate in the moment, depending on the situation. And there's a lot of different stimulus that we have as we get feedback from our audience. And even in this definition, we're trying to actively listen and we're trying to adapt to what we're doing, not only by that venue, but how that audience responds to the environment we're in. So if you remember back in that second part of the definition, I said we'd adapt our articulation based on the hall to make sure the music made it to the audience. Even more, as you get really advanced, we see their reactions and we understand if we might have to do a little bit more or a little bit less. And what I'm thinking of that is playing in a senior center, your ability to adapt, like in this kind of role, when you're at a retirement community, you might have to share drastically different for the comfort of the patrons. You can be too much of a good thing in those kind of environments. So now that we have that three-part definition, and a lot of this, really boils down to what we do in this verbal communication is that we adapt, we're flexible. You wonder why we're in the practice room so much, and that's so we can be a master of our instruments. That's why we perform so much before we got on stage, is that so we can take the theoretical of what we think we're going to do, and we get on stage and life hits, and every time we do one thing, there's a cause and effect. So as we break this down just a little bit deeper from that three-part definition, I wanted to maybe put it in three parts of a competency, as we always will improve and strive. And sometimes we might link each of the definitions at different times based on our understanding of the situation. And I tell you, sometimes we think we know what we're doing, and sometimes we're just mistaken. And that's funny when you talk to the audience afterwards and you thought you were just making these really awesome changes and we just confuse things. How many times have we done that in a conversation? I know I have. So in this three-part of the definition, we're going to go into three parts of how you develop. So in a competency in the workplace, we might have like a basic foundational competency, an intermediate level where you keep growing, and then that advanced level, depending on where you are learning that particular piece, where you are as a performer, where you are in that group. You have a life cycle with different things, and you might just be starting, you might be a few years in, or you just might be a seasoned professional. And so you can maybe reflect on a particular place that you are. And so at that foundational level, we really are going back to basics. We're trying to express those ideas. We're focused on the grammar and punctuation and spelling of things. And so that articulation and thoughts, the structure of the piece, we're trying to be very clear and concise. We're paying attention to all those cues that are going on, that verbal and non-verbal part of the communication, so to speak. And this really works well in a group setting or a duo or a trio or a larger group. But when I see this foundation, when I get from this is that we've learned that language. We understand what we're trying to communicate. And now we're basically trying to go beyond pushing the buttons. And we're basically having a call and response. We're starting to communicate with whoever we're with. We start to have some cause and effect. We do this because the audience is hearing that. Now, as we progress, we're going to call this next step intermediate communications. And at this point, we're expressing more facts and more ideas. We're conveying these moderate to advanced ideas, concepts, and information. So where we might have had that basic call and response, we're really starting to get a picture of who we're playing for and really how they're reacting. And even at this point, we might be designing our shows and designing how we play just to hit that particular audience. Going back to that senior community or retirement living center, you're going to probably communicate in that particular setting in the same way that, maybe you have to do this for an elementary school, that you design that show just so you can communicate well in that particular setting, which might, be a little bit different than, say, a subscriber series on a major symphony orchestra, that kind of thing. So when we get to this advanced part of communication, in the same manner, we've really done our research. We have a lot of feedback. We know that music has that cause and effect. We go backwards, we go forwards. We have inductive and deductive reasoning that are going on, especially because we've done a lot of interpretation and analysis. We understand what we're trying to put out there and convey. And we know that consequence of the decisions we've made and what we've made in the music. And we're maybe improvisatory for some of this commercial music that we're doing, or if we're in a cadenza, we really understand where we're going and what kind of impact we're trying to make. And we're trying to make sure that all of this information that we've digested gets out to that intended audience and it's received. We understand it made it to the audience by that feedback and that response we're getting. Maybe it is that nonverbal communication, how people are sitting in their seats, how they respond to us. We could have all those polls and surveys at the end, how we talk to people. And over time, we just keep developing. In the same way, we would do that and grow with feedback in our day-to-day verbal conversations. Now, as we keep looking at this communication idea, it's interesting to me because if you look at things from when you started your career to when, or where we are currently now, we can almost see that things are busier. It seems that everybody's multitasking. They're always thinking about what they need to accomplish next. Now, I think this was always going on, but you think about it, social media and this ever presence of technology is a little bit different than when I grew up in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, where, we had 3 channels. If we did want to go do something, we would have to go out to do it. Cable wasn't a thing yet. Streaming wasn't a thing. So how we communicated and how we did things, we could play the long game. It didn't have to be nested in bundles for how we digest things now to compete with all of these things people are doing. And so it's important to remember that people get distracted fast. If you're here, I'm so thankful because, you can get distracted like every 47 seconds or so, maybe 8.5 seconds into scrolling. You think about social media, I'm trying to grow in that. And if you don't have the right hook and the right immediate grab as you're doing that, people will scroll on. And that's tough as an old timer because I think differently. So we also might think of those lecture limits and time limits that we might have of people's attention span. So we might have 20 minutes to get what we need. So that TED Talk rule of 18 minutes might be what we need. Of course, podcasts can be a little bit longer because, you might be running on the treadmill, taking a walk. And even, when I'm focusing on something I'm actually doing, I might have gray squirrels running around everywhere. So every 75 seconds, I might just space out and try to figure out where I am. So it's sort of important to realize with our audience, they're going through this too. And so the more clear we are and the more we help them focus and we focus on them, then we can try to minimize that attention span gap. A tip that I oftentimes give is to give run times and the length of the pieces in your program notes, especially when you're talking to everyone, letting people know what's coming up so that they can understand what will be happening so they can focus on it. I was just at a show the other day, 5 completely new pieces. And hey, I'm a trained professional, especially as an audience member. I can say I'm an subject matter expert on sitting in the audience after going to shows for over 50 years, And sometimes I just need a little bit of help to understand what's going on. I want to know if that new piece is going to be a short one, 10 minutes, 7 minutes, 10 minutes, 15. And so that kind of courtesy when we talk gives that reasonable expectation and allows a better connection. So if I look at the business side of things and I look at communication like in a managerial setting, I see studies that say 90% of the problems in an organization are a direct result of poor communication. And wow, that happens in a business setting. Well, music's sort of a business. We're in that business model. We're communicating with other musicians and we're trying to communicate with our audience. So it fits really well when we sort of think this kind of concept on stage and some of the why, in my opinion, many artists are not as received quite as well as others on stage. They play really great. They try, but there's something missing with that communication side of things. I mean, they've all put in the time. They're very excellent. But it's funny. Some of these people just have this it factor. And I think that it factor is that they just communicate so effortlessly on stage. Now, I get it. It's like a duck. You know that you're always working in there. Your feet are always going underneath the water. But there's something special about how, even with a duck, their feet are always going, but on the surface, you can't see that. You could just see that calm and that effortless communication. Some people are just better at it than others. And so one reason for this, I think, is that performer with that it factor understands that they're in a conversation with the audience. And while some folks, they can be naturals at this, I think this is a learned trait. And I think one tip is just to think of this musical presentation as a conversation, that you're presenting your ideas in the same way as I'm speaking to you now. And I think it's just all in that communication part. Why we fail and how sometimes this doesn't go over is just because we think we're communicating something, this great musical idea, but it's not an indication that the communication has actually occurred or that music has left beyond the music stand and the stage and made it to the audience. Perfect example. Went to the orchestra just a few nights ago, listened to this wonderful German art song with the orchestra, and there were no notes about the words, no notes about what was being said, and it's been since high school since I've had German. And so there are parts of that wonderful, amazing piece and that rendition by this amazing soloist that were left aside because it was in German. In fact, one of the comments by the conductor was saying, well, I hope by some of his expressions you get what he's trying to convey in the piece. And I sat there in the audience, as an audience member, I'm going, but there was so much more that could have been said to help me understand, to create that moment. But I'm telling you, this particular artist sold the piece really well, but there was a gap because many of us in the audience didn't understand what was being said. And that's all right, because we can all understand that communication is a two-way street. But sometimes, we just live in that illusion that communication has taken place. We were on that stage. We played for that great audience. We played amazing. And in that moment in time, because of all this, we magically transcended and it made it to that audience. But we all wish it was just that simple and that easy. It really takes that advanced concept of that competency that we're talking about to make sure that what we're saying on stage as a musician musically actually gets to our audience. And it involves a lot of critical thinking on our part. And that critical thinking is amazing because it's allowed when we're communicating on stage. It's allowed when we're preparing in the practice room, trying to make sure that this is going to actually make it. A great question that I can ask, my tip for this would be to say, so what? And so when I think of that kind of a term, it could be like a why. When you do something on stage, when you do something in the practice room, so what? How is that going to impact your audience? So we're taking that past experience that you have. We're taking all that research that you have, and we're going to that live moment, and we're searching for how we're connecting best or better with our audience. And in that moment, in that same way that we're having this dynamic conversation with our friends and our loved ones, we're trying to go beyond this technique and the execution of our craft to communicate effectively. Now, I think one big barrier that we have to discuss when we're thinking about communicating to this large audience is that we're playing for this diverse audience. At any given time, you're going to have like 5+ generations just sitting there from every background imaginable. And I think it's interesting because when we think of the different generations, we think of generations in the workplace that we work with, musicians that we work with. Well, we can put this to the audience that we come to see us. And you have to think of how your music and your presentation might fit this large demographic group that's in your audience. Each of these people have different backgrounds. They have different expectations of the show. This might be their very first time ever coming to an event. And because of that, and their different histories, their different ages, their different backgrounds, they listen to things differently. Many of us grew up in the MTV era of like music videos. Hey, I remember the Sony Walkman coming out, and that's how we, would mobily listen to music on our cassette tapes. And then, of course, the invention of the CD. Okay, but I can go all the way back to the 8-track. And I think of listening to things on the radio or listening to things on shortwave. These are things that maybe people don't listen to in the same way now because they stream things. And our audiences are just different. Communication just isn't replicating that same show over and over. Sometimes you just need a course correction or a modification. And depending on your audience, this is to be encouraged. What's the definition of insanity? Is like doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. Here's something about programming and something about learning your audience and the demographics of your audience that I just remember. It struck me. I was a young warrant officer in the Army music program, and I was down in San Antonio, and we were planning shows. And I was spoken with one of our enlisted leaders, Al Marroquin, and talking through some program ideas of how we might incorporate some different music into our show. And I love Latin music, and of course he did too. That was one of his big things that he did. Even when he deployed, he led the Latin group. So dances for soldiers and things that interact. It always made it fun for the audience. Everybody was very interactive. People could get up and dance. They could move in their seats. And so we were just talking about Latin music, and we started talking about some of the real differences and what audiences might expect in San Antonio versus Miami. So the difference when he played for soldiers from diverse backgrounds would be different than if he had a focused audience. And when you think of Latin music, I'm curious to know what you think of. Same thing could be said if I said American music. And it's a lot more nuanced than you think. Just like with American music, you might think of country or pop or heavy metal or rock, R&B. You could go back to Dixieland and jazz. We could describe these things as American style. So if generically you said, I'm just going to play a concert of American music, it could be anything. I mean, we have Aaron Copland and all sorts of great American composers that have influenced our society. But we have Latin music. It's the same thing. You just can't categorize something so generally as a musician and think it's going to come off to a particular audience. They might not appreciate it. So as I was talking to Al, in San Antonio, we might like Tejano music. We might like mariachi, conjunto, norteño, which of course I always pronounce terribly, but we could always use something like a cumbia or some banda music. We wouldn't necessarily do salsa. But if I was talking to my friend Al Sanchez, who led different Latin groups with different Army bands, and he was on the East Coast, he would always play more salsa in his bands. Now, his background was more from Puerto Rico, so he loved that island kind of Latin influence, Afro-Cuban influence. But that salsa became more of a norm. But particularly in San Antonio, it's not like people would come up and say, how dare you play salsa? But to have that nuance to communicate effectively, it is a good thing to think about how you communicate within your programming to figure out what your specific folks would like. Because they'll tolerate everything, but you want them to be a part and make a memory for them. I think other things, when you think about all this diversity, some people might really like that connection, that pre-concert connection on social media. Some people like that pre-concert talk idea. Some people really like those extended liner notes that we might give. Some people really want that engaged talking. Some people, as we're thinking about this enhanced communication, we might put things on the stage. We might have interaction with our cell phones. So it's very distinctive just to understand how we can communicate and how we can finesse all these ideas and ways that we can communicate with our audiences. And so we want to design that show that connects with everybody. And isn't it a great problem to have that we have so many wonderful folks coming to our shows, and we have all these amazing styles of music that we can perform out of our musical toolbox? Now, all this stuff makes sense because we have a thing called this communication loop. And we always have a sender and a receiver. And we have that medium that carries the message, which makes great sense as a musician. Our instrument carries that message. And so we sort of think back to when we were kids. We get those two cups connected by a string, and you talk through the cup, it sort of vibrates and we're hoping when that cup and that string vibrates that maybe that would actually get the message from one side to the other. But in essence, all we hear is this muffled person yelling from the other side of the cup. And again, that's that illusion that something happened when you talked into the cup. We were excited and we were waiting for that communication to happen. And we're sitting there on the other side as a receiver going, oh, can I hear it? Can I hear it? And we're trying to make that connection. And just sometimes it just doesn't happen. Maybe the string's just not tight enough. The person didn't have their cup to the ear when they were trying to hear. So let's give you a couple more context to just sort of explain this point about how we can communicate more effectively. And we can sort of look at it in a different context. Let's go way back to the old wild, wild west. Let's go back to the 1840s, and we're going to talk about the invention of the telegraph. And again, at some point, we assume that we're going to go to the telegraph operator, we're going to pay, we're going to give them the message that we want to send, and then they're going to ... Morse code over the telegraph line. And once it's sent, we assume that someone's going to receive the message. But that message had to be broken down into that code, and then it had to be sent along the wire, and hopefully that wire works, and then hopefully it makes it the other side. But I was just listening to a radio broadcast, and I heard that in the early days of the telegraph, it was even more complicated because the telegraph was owned by different companies. So we think of a telephone game where you keep translating it from one person to the next. Well, the same thing happened in telegraph game. The telegraph lines were owned by different companies. So it had to go through multiple points. So at multiple times, it had to be encoded with that ... and then taken out and then putting back in. And so hopefully by the end, it would have gotten where it needs to go. Now, we can understand this even in the more modern era when we think about this generation. We think of that sender and encoding data like a computer, like an email. We know that that message gets encrypted into some sort of data element, and then it gets transferred to the other end, and then it gets decoded, and that receiver takes it all in. So if we put this into context for our audiences, we know that many of these folks are hearing our music for the first time, or the first time that we're playing this piece, and we're making lots of interpretive decisions. And so in this way, we may have to better explain our show or design our show or perform our show to allow that listener to understand what we're doing more effectively. Let me give you a quick example. Let's say you wanted to do a short, more contemporary piece. You might have to explain to the audience what's going to happen. You might have to demonstrate what kind of things they're going to hear, give them a warning and a help so that when they hear these things, what they might do is nod and affirm and look over to the other person next to them and say, hey, did you hear that? As opposed to just having that real shock value. And as they hear music for the first time with no warning, it oftentimes really is that startling or surprising experience. And while, we might want to have that in our toolbox of reactions, that might not be the norm. Because when I'm looking at the audience and I'm looking for Aunt Mary and Uncle Bill coming to your show, they might not have had these kind of events that have come along. And we want to make their experience really amazing. And so I thought we'd close up with a couple more tips about how we might use this new information, or just, the information I'm sure that many of you know. And so I sort of rebundled and repackaged this to maybe help you on stage. So the first thing is just maybe to let you study and know yourself and your personality strengths. And there's so many personality tests online, and you get a feel for who you are as a communicator, as a person. And that's important because if you know yourself, then you're going to be more comfortable communicating. And that might help you figure out how you need to change on stage to maybe adapt some of the things you do so that you can communicate more effectively. I'm going to put in the show notes some tests for some personality strengths that are just free, and you can sort of go with this. And this really works out well because, I used to have so many musicians that I was associated with when I was in the Army. Many of them were introverted. It was difficult for them to do that communication as a conversation in the lobby after a show or even on the stage, but they were really great in the practice room, and they would let the music speak for themselves, and they would have to figure out how they would use those strengths to communicate more effectively. So in that case, for example, when we talked about a better program, or sometimes we would have the person that could communicate well, you're always looking for that front person for a rock band that can be that Sammy Hagar, David Lee Roth for the Van Halen kind of a thing, so that Eddie Van Halen could sit in the background and just be himself. So the biggest takeaway that you can take when you're saying on stage and how you're going to play and how you're going to make sure that this stuff gets to the audience, it's probably just to record yourself. Use video, use audio, use your phone. These technologies weren't as easy to use when I was growing up. And so we have more power in our pocket than the Beatles had for all of their studio sessions. And we can use this effectively to make sure it gets to the audience. As a professional, I was in a lot of great professional groups, and I made it and met my goals being a saxophone player in a premier band in the Army. And it was a number of years, even after I had so-called made it, that when I played, I was doing exactly what I wanted. And that came from doing all those mini disc recordings. It was a mini disc recorder. And I would focus on my vibrato and the articulation and the dynamics. And it was funny because over the years, I really developed. It wasn't like anything was really bad, but it wasn't what I wanted to say. And so when I took these recordings and I cleaned things up, it helped me because I had more confidence that what I was going to say actually was said. And then in addition to those recordings and using that kind of technology, we have our friends and we have that circle that can help us understand if what we're saying actually comes off. We get that feedback, and we get those feedback from our audience. So if something doesn't work, we just do something differently next time. That's the great thing about live music. We always have the next opportunity. It's not a one-time event. It's a lifetime of experiences that we're a part of for our audiences. And in addition to that technical execution side, some of us might have to really start looking at some staging elements and some choreography or some physical movements. We can unleash our inner thespian. And so many of our shows, we may have to evaluate if we're visually engaging for our audiences. Sometimes we have to turn this from an oral art form, especially when we're live on stage. And that means we can include physicality. We should include movement as appropriate based on the personality, based on who you're communicating to. And we all need to strive to create this better atmosphere on the stage. And we're doing this so that we can create something special for the audience. A great new organization that, it's been around a few years. amazed at how many people follow them on Instagram, which was those candlelight concerts. And they set this amazing mood with all of these candles. And they set the scene and set the tone. And then they have music that people really want to listen to. Could be ABBA, could be Coldplay, could be Hans Zimmer. And they'll go out of their way to make this special event for their audience. So another thing you can just really do to make sure that you communicate effectively is really just to get to know your audience. You can greet them as they enter. You can ask them why they came, what they're doing there, what they're looking forward to. You can do that pre-concert talk. You can answer questions about the music being played. You can really be involved with social media, growing on this because I'm not as good at this, but I am great at scrolling through social media. Now, all of this is a lot of extra effort, but a relationship worth having takes some effort and some work in order to communicate. Now, if you like some of the concepts and the ideas that we talked about today, I would love for you to reach out and talk to us here at Intentional Musicianship. I have the link in our show notes, but it's just intentionalmusicianship.com. I'd love to hear your feedback on some of the ideas that we presented today and get to know your specific needs better. Each of you are personally welcome to schedule a free meet and greet Zoom call. Don't worry, it's not a hard sell or anything. It's just a way we can start to build a relationship together. And hey, you can reach out to us on Instagram as well. I'm trying to be more active. So we hope that some of these topics about communication were interesting to you. And I want to take this opportunity to say thank you for joining us today. We know your time is precious, and we really appreciate that you've taken the time to listen to us today. My hope is that we build a community where we can encourage one another through our mutual experiences performing live music. And I really look forward to connecting with each of you again on the next episode of Intentional Musicianship.